Hi, and welcome to 60 for 30, a budget Magic the Gathering project that looks to get you a playable 60-card deck for right around $30. Today, we're actually going to be continuing our Getting Into Modern series, where our target price point isn't $30, but much, much less than the $1,000 price tag that accompanies a lot of modern decks. We're going to be taking Tier 1 decks and making small changes to make them slightly less viable. You're not going to win any tournaments with these, but much, much, much more affordable. So today, we're going to be getting into Burn. Burn is a classic Magic archetype. It's played in Legacy, it's played in Modern, you see it from time to time in Standard. You play red things, you kill your opponent as quickly as possible, and that's pretty much all there is to it. And people bring up Burn a lot as the budget Magic list, because at $490 in Modern, that's actually fairly reasonable compared to some of the $1,000 price tags you'll see on decks. But unfortunately, we're a channel that generally looks to make $30 decks, and you can have success with a $30 deck, so we're not looking necessarily to pay almost $500 for just the main board of Boros Burn. But luckily, a lot of that price is tied up in the lands. And you'll see in the lands, this is a red deck. Mountains are very inexpensive. What gets expensive is splashing a little bit of white for Boros Charm and Lightning Helix, which are good burn spells, but the actual real world price and cost of including those, even though they're not that expensive themselves, is astronomical. So what we're going to do quite simply is trade out that massive expensive land base for 19 mountains. We're going to switch out the spells that use white for spells that don't use white, and make a few other budget substitutions, keep most of the deck the exact same, and that drops our main board price tag to right around $70, which is much, much, much more reasonable, and it's going to be cheaper if you already have some staples like Lightning Bolt. So, the deck itself. It's going to run small, fast creatures that put a very quick kill clock on your opponent. Monastery Swiftspear, you play it turn 1, you swing for 1 damage. You play another one turn 2, and then play a Lightning Bolt hitting your opponent for 3. They both trigger prowess and become 2, and you swing for another 4 damage, and there you've done 8 damage to your opponent on turn 2, with a very reasonable opening start. Monastery Swiftspear puts a ton of pressure on your opponent, and is actually very difficult for them to get creatures down and block because they don't know how many times you're going to be able to trigger prowess to give it better combat stats. And then you have Eidolon of the Great Revel, which is a weird looking card because it hurts you and your opponent, but playing Burn, your goal is to kill them as fast as possible, so it's worth you taking the 2 damage and betting that they're not going to be able to kill you as fast as you can kill them. So Eidolon is a 2/2 creature, so it can attack and get in for damage, but any time they play a spell, it's going to be chipping away at their life total, which is extremely relevant. Then you have the bread and butter, the spells that just do damage to your opponent's face. Lightning Bolt, 3 damage, 1 mana. Lava Spike, 3 damage, 1 mana. Rift Bolt, 3 damage for 1 mana as long as you wait a turn with the suspend ability. So you pay 1, exile it, next turn it does 3 damage. And Lightning Bolt and Rift Bolt can target creature or player, so the skill involved in Burn is knowing when to clear your opponent's blockers and when to just bolt them in the face. We have more damage spells. We have Skullcrack, which is super useful in just 3 damage to the face, instant speed, but it also prevents life gain and preventing damage, which a lot of decks, Burn is very well constructed to do exactly 20-ish damage to your opponent. So if they swing in with a 5 power lifelink creature, that's going to put them in a great spot unless you Skullcrack it to do 3 damage and prevent that 5 life gain. So Skullcrack is very effective in specific situations. And then Searing Blaze, so here's the thing, I have to be upfront. We're cutting fetch lands from this list because we don't want to pay for them, and we can make do without the white. But Searing Blaze has a landfall trigger. When a land enters the battlefield, Searing Blaze does 3 damage to a player and a creature, instead of just the 1 on its normal ability. And fetch lands are very good for allowing you to have a land enter the battlefield on your opponent's turn so that you can cast this at instant speed. One of the biggest things that we're actually sacrificing in this budget list is Searing Blaze will almost always be a sorcery, which isn't necessarily the worst thing, but does lose some of the effectiveness and the outplays that you can make in a list with a lot of fetch lands. So keep that in mind. It's another sacrifice that we're making for these beautiful, cheap 19 mountains over here. So then this is where the deck differs. In the expensive $500 version, you're going to be running 4 Goblin Guides, which is a 2/2 creature with haste, which is insane, but whenever it attacks, your opponent can potentially draw a card. That's not actually always the downside, because you can see what your opponent is going to be drawing if it's not a land card, but generally you're helping your opponent out there. But obviously you don't care so much about that because you're hitting them for 2 damage on turn 1, you're hitting them for 2 damage on turn 2, you're putting a lot of pressure on with Goblin Guides. So instead of paying $20 a copy for Goblin Guides, we're going to spend 40 cents a copy on our Bomat Couriers, which if you play Standard you should be very familiar with this card. It's a 1/1 creature with haste instead of a 2/2 for Goblin Guide, so that's the cost here, but actually Bomat Courier is card advantage for us instead of our opponent, so there are going to be some games where this ability to discard your hand and put all cards exiled with it into the owner's hand is going to win you the game, because say you're 3 or 4 points of damage short of being able to kill your opponent, and you're out of cards in your hand, you pay 1 mana, sacrifice Bomat Courier, and you can draw 2 or 3 lightning bolts off the top of your deck, which is actually extremely useful as far as giving burn that extra reach. So it's not quite as good as Goblin Guide, but it's actually giving some different functionality to the deck that I think is quite effective. And then we have Grim Lavamancer, which is another cheap creature. It can attack, but really what it does is exile cards from your graveyard to kill creatures and do damage to your opponent. It's a good way to get those last few points of damage through when you're really running out of cards, because you can use the cards that you've already cast because they're in your graveyard. You can use your fetch lands. We don't have fetch lands, we don't want to pay $13 for a card, so Grim Lavamancer would be less effective in our deck, and it's expensive. We're going to be cutting that copy for 1 Ball Lightning. This is just, hey, 3 mana, here's a 6/1 trample creature with haste that gets to attack for 1 turn. Deal with it, and that also gives us a lot of reach, but in a different way than Grim Lavamancer. And then I talked about cutting white out of the deck. The opportunity cost for this is actually really, really low. I actually think that Searing Blaze is a bigger downside to the deck, losing the ability to do that at instant speed, than cutting Lightning Helix for Lightning Strike. They both do 3 damage to any target for 2 mana, but Lightning Helix gains you 3 life. But keep in mind that we're not playing lands that hurt us, like fetch lands and shock lands. So in some cases, that life gain is actually negated by the fact that we're not running white in the deck at all. And then we have another white exclusion, Boris Charm. 4 damage to target player for 2 mana. Searing Spear is 3 damage to target creature or player, so it gives you more flexibility on removing creatures for 1 less point of damage to your opponent. You will miss that point of damage sometimes. You'll be like, man, I got them down to 1, and if only I had Boris Charm. But really, because you don't actually use the 2nd and 3rd modes of Boris Charm very often, you're not losing that much from Searing Spear, and you are gaining a little more functionality because it can target creatures as well. And that brings us to our sideboard. It's $8. It just gives you some added percentage points to your win percentage against certain matchups. You bring in Dragon's Claw to gain some life against the Burn Mirror, Searing Blood against creature-heavy decks like humans to slow down their clock and apply pressure to them, Smash to Smithereens for affinity, for KCI, to get extra damage through and throw them off their plan, Tormod's Crypt for graveyard synergies and strategies, and then Exquisite Firecraft is just extra burn, and it's, I think the damage can't be prevented or countered, has some rider like that. I think it's decent against control, or things that would otherwise be preventing your damage. So here you go. It's not the tier 1 sideboard list that you would normally be running, but it's a decent $8 replacement that'll actually give you a fairly functional sideboard against a lot of strategies. Okay, so there's my primer. That's burn. So how do we go from watching this video to actually owning a burn deck in Modern? So step 1 is figuring out if you want the deck. You've seen this video, but think about it. It's not a $500 investment, but a $70 investment in a deck, plus the sideboard, is still fairly significant. So think if you really want it, watch some pros play it, and make sure that it's a deck you're going to be happy with. Burn isn't for everybody. Some people are addicted to the fast-paced, just kill them as quickly as possible lifestyle. Some people prefer decks where they feel like they're outplaying their opponents more. So make sure that it's actually a deck that you want to be playing. And then buy the budget version. You don't need the sideboard if you're willing to go without one for a while, but again, I recommend the sideboard. There's actually a lot of our price is also held up in Lava Spike, and if you want to cut extra cross, you could run shocks instead of there, but again, you're taking damage out of your deck, so less effective, but you can probably save another $15 on the deck by replacing Lava Spikes with shocks. Use tcgplayer.com. I'm not a shill for them. They just have all the cards you need, and they're generally the cheapest way to do it. But also keep in mind that you can trade for pieces of this deck. You can use store credit if you've won a few events at your store recently, or you can go to your store and trade in that Sweet to Fairy that you pulled in a Dominaria pack, but you aren't using it for anything. Trade that in for some store credit, and then buy this deck for much less than the $70 price tag it currently has. There are ways to do things on a budget if you're willing to put in the extra work and figure it out. Then, if you didn't get the sideboard before, get this budget sideboard. You just need a sideboard to play Modern. There's really not much more to it than that. And then this is the interesting part. How to upgrade from our $70 list to that $500 list. And you have to prioritize strategically, right? Remember, you have your trades and store credit available. You can whittle away at your Goblin Guides at $20 a copy if you need to just get rid of cards that you're not using anymore for them. And watch for reprints and rotation. Things like Inspiring Vantage is rotating out of Standard soon, so you can pick it up on the cheap after that. Sacred Foundry is being reprinted soon, so that price should go down. So just keep an eye open for the cards you need if Goblin Guide shows up in a Master set or something like that. And then as far as priorities, I would start with the Goblin Guides because they're extremely effective and important to Bird's plan. And then they actually work fairly well in our mono red version, which Grim Lavamancer doesn't work as well without the fetch lands. Then I'd add white with some budget red-white lands like Inspiring Vantage and Battlefield Forge. Get your Boros Charms, your Lightning Helix, put a Plains in there. Just add a little bit of white so that you can play red-white. Then it's probably time to bite the bullet if you still really like the deck and get your fetch lands, your shock lands. That's going to hurt, but hey, if you want the deck to be as competitive as possible, that's what you're doing. But also keep in mind, you don't need the deck to be as competitive as possible. If you're just taking this to your local store once a week to play with the people there, if you're playing this with your friends, if you're not planning on taking down a Pro Tour anytime soon, you don't need to get all the Arid Mesas and whatnot. The deck will work fairly fine without them. But if you want to dedicate your life and your money to Burn, you buy the real lands, gotta do it. And then you have your Grim Lavamancer, which will work really well with those fetch lands, and then we'll start working on a real sideboard. Look up what Burn uses, figure out what you need for your local meta, whoever you play with, and buy accordingly. And that's it. That is Burn on a budget, $70, $8 sideboard, and you can get into Modern and play a fairly effective deck that's a lot of fun hitting people with lightning bolts for not a lot of money. So that's it. I'm Sam with 60 for 30. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, talk to me about this deck on Reddit, talk to me about this deck in the comments. Tell me if you would have done anything differently in your budgetization of this list. And have fun out there, boys and girls. That's what it's all about.